Good evening. You're tuned in to the ghostly broadcast, Paranormal Station. I am your host, Timothy. Here on my farm, I gather testimonies from across the globe and spread them out to you, dear listeners. Tonight, our tales are about traveling the open road. In the bygone days of yore, travel was always a risk. You could run into bandits, thieves, and highwaymen alike, taking your life into your own hands and risking the unknown. These days are no different, especially when you encounter the supernatural. Lean into your cab seat and enjoy this road trip across Europe and its veil of the paranormal. Our first story. Dear Timothy, my name is Richie. I'm a lad from northern England, but a few months ago, some old friends and I decided to rent a camper van and head out on the NC 500. A 500-mile trip around the north of Scotland. Rob, Adam, and I decided to throw caution to the wind and head off the beaten path. You can more or less park up anywhere in Scotland and camp the night, so long as you aren't bothering anyone. You clean up after yourself, and we were keen to see more of the Isles than we had before. So, taking some ferries out to the Outer Hebrides, we were eager to see some sights. I'm an avid historian, and I love all things ancient. And these islands are littered with some of the best preserved old structures. They were built by the people who occupied them long before even the Romans arrived. Looking around on Google Maps, we found an absolutely fantastic spot to pitch up for the night. On the island's western coast, there looked like a small natural bay and a little inland lock to do some paddle boarding in the morning. It was also right next to the ruins of an Iron Age broch. It was perfect. By the time we got there, it was already pretty dark, and with nothing to light the roads or the area but the headlights of the camper van. We pitched up and settled in. Feasting like kings and drinking like fish, I'll be the first to admit that we might have all had a bit too much last night. But none of that had any bearing on what happened later that night. At some ungodly hour of the morning, I was awakened by gusts of wind that rocked the camper. With a hangover already setting in, I tried to bury my head into the pillow and avoid being sick. But then we heard footsteps and whispered voices. I asked if my friends were awake, and if they heard it too. They had, and Adam was already up and looking out of the window by his bunk. "There's someone out there," Adam whispered. I got out of my bunk and looked out the side window. There, staring right back at me, were 3 people. "Look, there's more of them," said Rob, who was frantically scrambling out of the bunk underneath mine. "Who are they?" I asked. Looking out of the windows, I could see they had surrounded us. Bare-chested men and women, painted in the moonlight with dark swirls on their skin and faces. They were clad in furs around their waists, carrying sticks, clubs, and spears. One of the bearded men began to let out a guttural groan and rhythmically beat his spear and feet into the ground. The others started to follow along, singing in low, groaning moans as they stared right into my eyes. The whites of their eyes shone as they glowered at us. "This has got to be a sick joke," Rob said as he threw his shorts, socks, and boots on. "What are you doing?" I asked. "I'm going out there. They're just some locals trying to mess around with us," he said. The camper began to shake in the wind, throwing Adam from his bunk and putting me and Rob off balance. A few choice words followed, and we argued with Rob about what to do. None of us had any signal, which wouldn't have mattered anyway. We were about as far out of the way as possible for any emergency services to get to us. Before we could stop him, Rob decided to charge out of the camper van door. "Yeah, really effing funny," he started to shout. Me and Adam followed after him. The groaning and chanting got louder. The painted men and women remained in place, stomping their feet and slamming their sticks to some ethereal beat. "Just F off," Rob barked as he approached one of them. In a flash, the man he had squared up to hit him across the head in one smooth motion with his club. Rob turned to us in a daze as blood poured down his face before he fell to the floor. I let out a scream and they moved to surround us. Adam was grabbed and taken off, kicking and screaming, and I felt an arm wrap around my neck. I kicked and fought, but the grip was too tight. I could breathe, but felt my head lighten, and I was unconscious. When I woke up, it was daylight. I regret to say I'd run out of the camper in nothing but my boxers. I felt cold and ill, and my head pounded. I sat up and looked around. I was lying among some boulders and ruins with Adam, and Rob sprawled out before me. We'd been laid out in some kind of tri-pointed star. All three of us were covered in deep blue painted swirls. I saw similar patterns painted on the people who had accosted us last night. Rob's head injury looked like it had been tended to, and I managed to rouse them both awake. All three of us felt like death, but were otherwise unhurt. The camper was a few hundred meters from us, and we realized we'd be laid out inside the ruins like some kind of sacrifice. The camper itself had been covered in paint as well, scratchings and markings. Blue swirls and crosses adorned it, but there was no sign of the people we'd seen last night. We cleaned ourselves up and washed the camper down with seawater. We couldn't see anyone around for miles, but wanted to get out of there and off the island. An uneasy feeling came over all of us. We called the trip after that and headed home. All three of us seemed to be okay physically, but I still have this feeling that something happened to us that night. I know something definitely happened to me because, once in a blue moon or so, I find myself dreaming. I'm out in the vast, treeless expanse, bathed in the moonlight and battered by the wind. My naked body is taken over by moving, swirling patterns, moving like snakes. And I hear those groans, the guttural singing to the rhythmic beat. I hear languages whispered that I don't understand. I feel like I've been marked, tainted by something. It follows me. Every time I wake up in cold sweats, I feel more and more like my skin isn't my own. What could have happened to us? What ancient ritual was performed? Were we just in the wrong place at the wrong time? The other day, my wife caught me moaning to myself. I didn't even realize I was doing it. Just a low, monotonal humming from my throat. I don't know how long I have, but I know it's worsening. I reached out to Adam and Rob. We've all decided to return and try to get some answers. Maybe we'll find some. Perhaps you or your listeners might have some as well. Either way, I feel like we don't have a choice anymore. Yours, Richie. Thank you for that testimony, Richie. Just as we find our connections to the unknown planes of existence that cross time and space, so did our ancestors, no matter where they made hearth and home. Our next testimony comes from Emil and the fjords of Norway. Dear Timothy, this is still fresh in my memory as my friends and I just returned from our trip. We were fjord hopping around the national parks, stopping in laybys and campsites. When we reached Forollhogna, we had a few different hikes we wanted to do. So we spent quite a bit of time driving in a circuit and pitching up in the woods during the night. We were all in good spirits, drinking and smoking most nights, and trying not to overdo it on the climbs. On the second night, I noticed something out in the dark. I saw something glinting on the periphery of our campfire light. I aimed my torch towards it, and two shining yellow eyes glowed in the dark, disembodied from anything that my torch could pick up. I got up to look, but they darted out of view and off into the brush with a rustling of leaves. I called out to my friends to see if they had seen it too, but none had. I shrugged it off, thinking it must have been a deer or something, and we went to bed. After another good day hiking and driving to the following location the next night, we were camped in a completely new place, miles away from the previous night's campsite. I noticed those same glinting eyes out of the corner of my vision. "Look," I whispered to my friends as I shone my torch towards the yellow glowing pinpricks in the darkness. This time, there was no mistaking them. A pair of disembodied yellow eyes watched from just beyond our camp. But then, there was another pair. I stood up and stepped forward while my friends watched slack-jawed. I wanted to see if I could get a better view of them. But just like last night, they scattered off into the night, shaking the trees and branches as they darted off. We all chuckled to ourselves, but it didn't make me feel any easier. Still, we carried on as usual and hiked the next day. Mounted up in the car and drove to the next campsite, miles down the road. That night, it wasn't me who saw the eyes first, but one of the others. They called us over from the campfire after stepping away to relieve themselves. My friend had slowly backed up to us, shining his torch out into the dark. The same yellow eyes stared at us from the darkness. Only there wasn't just one or two pairs of them. There were hundreds. So many that I couldn't count. All hovering out there in the dark with no body to them that we could see. Unblinking and watching. We all stood up, armed with our flashlights, to try and see what they were. I tentatively stepped closer to see if they would scatter again. They didn't. None of us knew what to do. For the rest of the night, we were silent. We tried our best to keep watch, staring back at the eyes of the creatures haunting our camp. In the morning, the eyes were gone, and everything seemed undisturbed. We'd all passed out huddled together around our campfire, but sprang awake at the first crack of dawn. As we walked around our camp, trying to find a sign of whatever had been watching us, we saw hundreds and hundreds of footprints. Human footprints. We cut short that day's hike and hightailed it out of there. None of us felt right after that, and we figured we needed to drive for a day or two and stay in a decent hotel bed for a little bit. We all hoped that we'd just been pushing ourselves too hard. And I guess that we all silently wanted to think that we'd all collectively imagined it. I know what I saw, though, Timothy. They were watching us, warning us, telling us to leave their domain. I'm glad we managed to hike the fjords we wanted to, because I don't think I ever want to go back there. If I find myself driving through it again, I will drive hard, fast, and never at night. Yours, Emil. Thank you, Emil, for your intriguing testimony. Our third story. Dear Timothy, I've been driving HGVs for 20 years across the UK. No matter what, I've always stuck to my hours. I've never driven tired, and I'm positive I did not hallucinate what happened. I was driving along the A14 in the short hours towards Coventry. The road was empty, and the weather was clear. I couldn't see a thing coming for miles. There wasn't a soul out there. I glanced down to grab a sip of coffee. The second I took my eyes off the road, I heard a horn. like it was right in my ears. I looked up and saw another lorry coming straight towards me. It was yards away. I slammed the brakes and turned for the hard shoulder in a futile gesture while I covered my face with my other arm. My truck came to a harsh stop on the side of the road, but I didn't hit anything. I looked up and saw nothing but a straight, empty road ahead. There wasn't a mark on me or my wagon. I checked the rear view to try and see the lunatic driving on the wrong side of the road, but there wasn't any sign of him. I couldn't even see a break in the central reservation. The barriers separating the sides of the road were intact for as far as I could see. I jumped out of the cab to see if there was any damage. There wasn't a single sign of an accident. No debris. Nothing. All I could see were tire tracks. At first, I assumed they were mine, which most of them were, except I noticed some at an impossible angle. They were coming right at my tracks from the other side of the road. They weren't as fresh and black as mine. They looked like they'd been there a good while. I gave my head a shake, got back in the cab, and drove to the nearest motorway services to take a break. While there, I had a quick Google on my phone for any incidences on the A14 where an HGV was on the wrong side of the road. It turned out that there had been not too long ago. Some poor sod had his wagon locked up on him while he was doing 50 down the road. His brakes failed, and he crossed over the reservation and straight off the other side of the road. He was pronounced dead at the scene. I hope the poor bloke didn't suffer, and I hope his company had hell to pay for sending him out in a dodgy unit. I still wonder why he beeped his horn at me, though. Unless he was beeping it when he died. Thanks, Ian. Thank you, Ian. It's a sad fact that many paranormal incidences have their origins in something traumatic. Something that causes a human soul to scream out against the cosmos and tear into a time, if just for a fraction. Our next testimony comes from the alpine roads of northern Italy. Dear Timothy, my name is Matteo, and back in the summer, I saw something I couldn't believe. I travel a lot for my job as a photographer, and I've always had my camera with me. But that day, it didn't do me any good. I was due to take some photos at a concert in Munich, and with the weather still warm, I decided to go off-piste and take the scenic route. Get some good shots in Venice, a few in the Alps, and a stop at Zell am See before getting to the job. I had time, so I figured, why not make a little solo trip of it? I don't know exactly what road I was on, and I think that was maybe the point. I was up in the national park, and the last significant place I'd passed was the ski resort, Cortina d'Ampezzo. I made a few turns here and there, and I'll admit, I got pretty lost. I was coming up a single rack lane trying to find a viewpoint to get some good sunset shots. I remember a wooden bridge crossing a little stream, but then it was nothing but thick trees and a steep mountainside. A few hundred meters around switchbacks, I saw what I thought was roadkill coming up around the bend. As I rounded the corner, I saw more bloody piles of fur and gristle. Then I noticed a head. I stopped the car to behold the grisly sight. The entire road was lined with goat heads. Some were old, covered in flies and maggots, missing eyes and strips of flesh. Others looked fresh with puddles of slick scarlet underneath them where they'd been placed. They lined the road as far around the next curve as I could see. I got my camera from my passenger seat and started taking pictures. I stepped a few meters down the road, snapping away at my camera. The smell hit me, and I wanted to vomit. I gagged. It seemed like I'd crossed a threshold between this gruesome spectacle and the cool mountain air. After that, the whole place gave me the creeps. I didn't want to drive any further down that road. I don't know if it was a sick joke or a warning, but someone put a lot into putting those heads there, and I wanted nothing to do with it. I eventually hit all my stops and got to the gig in time. My whistle-stop tour went by without a problem. The only time I gave that day any thought was when I got back home and started to process my raw photos. All of the pictures that I'd taken were unavailable. I mean, they were there. The metadata of the time and date they were taken and how much memory they were taking up was all there. But every single image had been corrupted, unviewable. It sounds convenient, doesn't it? But it's actually why I'm writing to you. I was going to put them up, maybe some stock photo money for horror channels, or perhaps even make some local news story. But instead, they're all gone. How could that happen? The heads, to me, felt like a warning. A marked way that cautions anyone about continuing. Whatever it is that's down there, it doesn't want to be seen. Yours, Matteo. Thank you for your testimony, Matteo. One of the risks we run when trying to catalog the supernatural is that it often wants to avoid being observed and recorded. This has been Ghostly Broadcast, Paranormal Station. I've been Timothy, hosting you this evening on my farm, harvesting the fruit of our endeavors into the mysteries surrounding our physical world in a tangled web of unknown, spiritual void. If you enjoyed this broadcast and would like to join us for our next one, like, subscribe, and tap the bell icon to be notified. Until then, have a good evening.